Hello, friends. Welcome back to the show, the Strong Store Podcast. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Katie Feltmate. Katie is a poet based in my home province of Nova Scotia. She believes in the writing process as a tool for healing and self-growth, and I would agree with her on that. In 2021, she released her first self-published poetry book, Love in the Age of Quarantine, which is about, in my words, transitioning from an abusive and toxic relationship to a more whole self. I found her book in a local bookstore and immediately noticed the stoicism in her writing, especially near the end of the book where she has her past trauma behind her. In this episode, we talk about abusive relationships, loneliness and self-discovery, the paradoxes and complexity of love, and much more. I was thrilled to speak with Katie, and I think what follows is a very open conversation about some very difficult topics. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Katie as much as I do. So without further ado, please welcome Katie Feltmate. Well, you got your copy. I got my copy. I got the signed copy.
Yes, thank you for getting that.
Yeah, no, it was...
So I forget, how did you end up finding it? Or
Yeah, I was thinking about that today. So I think... I can't remember the exact order of things, but I think I found some of your content on Instagram, and I think you had some of your poetry just on there.
Yes.
And there was a couple there that struck me as particularly stoic, or at least stoicing, like on the journey to stoicism.
Yeah, I can think of a few.
Yeah. So I think I reached out to you and commented on a few of those, and we had a little chat about it, and I ended up buying your book, and just really loved it. And I think the openness and the honesty, I'd imagine you get a lot of praise for that part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that part of it. What I would say I like most about it, because I'm a weirdo, is there's a bit of darkness in it. Mm-hmm. There's a bit of darkness there, but it's ultimately full of hope. And so I'm happy you're here. I'm really excited to chat with you about it. And I guess just for those who maybe don't know who you are or don't know what the book is about, would you mind just starting with a bit of a background on it and why you wrote it?
Sure. So my name is Katie Feltmate, and I am from Nova Scotia. I grew up in Halifax, but I live in the South Shore now. So I'm a writer, and I write poetry and music. And in 2020, I had a really difficult year emotionally. And so to kind of manage my emotions and process what I was going through, I started writing poetry every day, and this was something that I had done all of my life, but this was a really intentional practice that kind of developed during COVID. And it was out of necessity at the time, but it grew into this really fulsome manuscript of work. And so I ended up having quite a big amount of work there, and I decided I wanted to share that because there was a lot of themes that I knew other people could relate to. So the book is called Love in the Age of Quarantine, and it's written in 2020, that whole year of the pandemic, in the context of me leaving an abusive relationship, but still living in the environment where the abuse had occurred, where I had been living with that partner. And so when lockdown happened, we were all forced to be in our homes 24/7. So I didn't have the outlet to, escape kind of that environment and all of those memories, because I couldn't go to work. I couldn't go to the gym. So all of that trauma was just sort of living, in the grout and the tile. It was on the walls, and I had no choice but to really face it and process it really directly. And so that's what I did with my writing. And I learned how to self-publish. I actually researched, the pros and cons of traditional versus self-publishing, and chose self-publishing for, the financial benefits of it. And so then I published my book in 2021, been marketing it ever since. It's gotten into mainstream bookstores such as Chapters, Kohl's, as well as a lot of local bookstores here and abroad as well. And really the book is kind of represents, I guess, like a time capsule of that year in my life. And it's the evolution of me kind of finding my way back to myself and finding my way back to healing and self-love.
Yeah, that's great. Do you, you know Joel Plaskett by chance?
Yes.
Yeah, so most people probably don't know him, but he's a local musician and he does producing for local musicians. And he has this idea where he said when a musician comes in and they write an album, it's like you have to, when you leave that studio, you got to hang your hat on something. It's like that's a phase of my life that's done and over with. And I actually read your whole book again today in preparation for this interview.
Wow.
So I'm well versed. But it's really a process. Like it is like your book is a process from a real bad situation, slowly learning to manage and deal with a lot of the stuff that you went through, and coming on the other side of it with a lot of, I think, Stoic ideas, which is really cool. And you mentioned loneliness and sort of looking inward a lot in the book. The pandemic was an interesting one because it forced us to have solitude, and there's a lot of philosophical practice that encourages you to have some time alone. But like, how do you think about that in particular, like this loneliness aspect, this solitude aspect of the pandemic? I mean, was that something that maybe you didn't do before that, or what have you kind of learned by being alone more?
Well, I think that definitely, the pandemic did teach me a lot about how I, cope in isolation, and what kind of, I don't know, what can come out of that time of isolation or loneliness. For me, it was the most productive, like highly producing time of my life, because I, being alone in the apartment so much, like having all of this to process, I had so much time to do that inner work and do that healing. And so I think that I was able to really see that benefit in that time alone and having that space, because we don't always have space for like stillness in our life, and that time to really meditate and reflect. And one of the things I was dealing with was that in trying to process the trauma of this relationship, I actually was quite regimented in my schedule, which I'm not normally like that, because I'm very like creative and kind of chaotic and I just go with the flow. But in this case, it was actually really necessary for me to create a lot of structure in my life, right? My life was just these walls of my apartment. And so I meditated more than I have ever in my life. I practiced yoga more than I had ever. I exercised immensely at that time as well. And like I said, it was really, I produced so much. I was able to produce this whole book in that time. So I think that there is a lot of silver lining or benefit to having that time alone. And in this case, it was forced due to the pandemic. But for me, I'm actually really grateful for that time of my life. And I look back on it now and I don't want to like contrive those circumstances again, but I would love to kind of be able to have that time and space again to myself.
Yeah, and I think certainly that's something that you can always voluntarily do, but it's a hard thing to really commit yourself to. A few things happen when you spend time alone, and I think people who fear that, they fear the demons that come back to life when you spend time alone. There's something that happens when you reduce the external chaos around you. All of a sudden, it allows the internal chaos within you to kind of manifest itself. So it starts to bubble up. Really, I think people distract themselves from dealing with a lot of that internal chaos. And, you're going to think of a lot of things that are probably going to scare you when you spend a lot of time alone. But on the other side of that, obviously, there's huge benefits. What about the downside? Because there's also a lot of passages where this is kind of like that paradox there, where you need alone time and you also need social time. A lot of people, probably most people, would say that the pandemic was a time where they needed more interaction. They missed their friends. They missed their family. It was the time of FaceTime. It was a time when we learned how important face-to-face communication is, and handshaking and hugs and all that stuff that we took for granted, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's so much I want to pick up in what you just said there. But first of all, just along the lines of, when you're alone, it is that time for like demons and things to come out of people. And that's why a lot of people do like avoid spending too much time alone with their thoughts, right? So there's a poem in the book where I'm actually encouraging people to do that. And I say something like, go inward until you've learned every childhood wound by heart and learn to love it all. Because I think that there is so much utility to doing that work. But in terms of, the impact it has on us as humans not being together, that's something that I wrote about a lot in the book, as you know, and a lot towards the end of the book, because really it was commenting on human nature and what we were going through. And it was this time where the whole world was going through it, the same thing and in different ways. But it really just showed me how much as humans we do suffer from not having each other, not being able to like hold hands or hug or be in the same like space with people, and the impact that has on our mental health. So I reflected a lot about that. It was a very prominent kind of feeling to me at the time, something that I had not experienced, of course, like in my life to that point. Something I didn't expect. I didn't expect that, we'd ever have a time where, we couldn't be like close to people. We couldn't be in proximity. And I think that makes you, grateful for when we were able to reunite with people. But another, I guess, downside or another lens to look at in regard to doing this inner work, doing this journaling or this writing for healing, that I would put forward is, considering that when you are digging deep and writing about these things, you have to be a little bit careful, because although it can be very cathartic and very healing and empowering, it can also be a little bit re-traumatizing. So there's a poem in the book where I kind of describe this feeling of boiling myself alive, because in that practice of every day going to my paper and pen and, revisiting the events that happened and processing things, there was a point where it would affect my headspace negatively, because, I am re-traumatizing myself a little bit in a way. So I think if you are going to do that practice, like, you want to just be a little bit careful about it, make sure you have some self-care. And again, that's why I meditated and I, called friends, and I tried to keep like lightness in my life. But yeah, that's another side to it that I think is important to note.
Yeah, it's that Nietzsche quote of staring into the abyss. Do you know this one I'm talking about? I wish I could remember exactly what it was, but it's something like, if you stare into the abyss too long, the abyss is also staring back at you. So you have to be careful, because if you dig too deep into darkness, you can reach the point where you no longer see the light. And the other end of that is your eyes adjust, and so you actually find the light in the darkness. And that's a beautiful thing. Like, for anyone that's struggling, what you can really do, like if you're going through a rough time, all you can really do a lot of times is just go through it. Is just keep going, keep on keeping on. And you only really see the stars when the sun goes down. So eventually your eyes adjust and you see the light. So it's kind of it's a very beautiful philosophical idea that no matter how dark it gets, there's always a light that can spark there. And we talked about Lord of the Rings a lot before this, because we're both nerds about that. But Tolkien has that idea where above all shadows rides the sun. But then you look at someone like Sauron, who for the non-nerds out there, is someone who became evil by delving too deep into evil. So it didn't really work out too well for him. So it certainly is more than possible for you to delve a bit too deep into the dark arts, let's say, where you lose yourself, and that is a real fear.
Yeah, and I think you don't want to spend too much time like dwelling on the negative. But I think what really empowered me and motivated me in this process was, number one, I've always been a person that used writing, whether it be like songwriting or poetry, to help bring me out of things. But what I think really motivated me was I just had this feeling, this like thought in my heart that, this trauma and these bad things that have happened to me, that this person did to me, these bad experiences that I've had, they can mean something. I can draw meaning from it if I can create utility out of it. Like if I can turn this like, ugly thing into something like beautiful and something that, if I can use like metaphor and just build something out of this, that really motivated me and helped me kind of move through it, because it sort of felt like I'm not just doing this for me, but I'm putting this book together for anyone who has ever been with an abusive partner, who's ever felt these emotions of like fear and pain, or anyone who's been, called names, or in my case, like, had someone like stalk you and like break into your apartment, like, anyone who's known what it feels like to feel unsafe in your home. So I knew that unfortunately a lot of people can relate to that, a lot of women, but also men. And I knew that there was some utility in me sharing that. So I think it gave purpose to the pain that I went through. And in my life, that's sort of a common theme of if I can create some purpose from it, it helps me move through things and process them, and then get to a place where I'm actually grateful for the experiences in some ways.
Yeah, and that's where your stoic ideas come through, the unfiltered. But yeah, I mean, it's a very stoic thing. Something happens to us, and most of life is not up to you. Like most of life is outside of your control, right? So the little piece of pie that you have agency over, it's so tiny. And last year I really did a lot of work on this, but I feel like it's really just about surrendering to how much is not up to you. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to traumatic experiences like that, a lot of times we have some small part to play in that, but overall, a lot of it is just not up to us. And so we have to look back at that and think, okay, well, that happened. That's done. That it happened. It's in the past. Mm-hmm. So what can we do today to make ourselves better from that? And I would agree, like writing is such a great avenue for that. I guess the other drawbacks, in terms of spending too much time alone, just to close the loop on that, I think clinically, if you spend too much time alone, you actually do become clinically insane, because you need some externals to kind of inform you on where you are, because we can't really see ourselves. And I certainly saw that in some of the passages in your book where, you're talking about just being alone in solitude and the benefits of that, but also just COVID took a lot out of people, I think. And then if you add on the abusive relationship, and it's like, holy shit, what do we do? What do we do with this, right? Yeah. But yeah, I mean, what do you think about that? Like, do you going through that loneliness, which we all experienced during COVID, how did that kind of play in with your I don't know, your self perspective? I don't really know what I'm trying to ask here, but
that makes it so easy.
I know, right?
I guess like I would just bring it back to this idea that as difficult as loneliness can be, there can be benefits that come from it, I suppose. Like there can be kind of silver linings, and that is easier for some people and a lot harder for others, right? Like some people don't like to be alone anyway. I'm a person that, I have these hobbies I do alone, like writing music and, writing poetry. And so I'm someone that I can naturally like spend a lot of time kind of just with myself. But I think the pandemic was really hard on, everyone, but, the extroverts like really suffered. And, but at the same time, I think it's an important practice that it's a kind of like a muscle that everyone should flex. Like, get comfortable. That's one of my messages in the second chapter. The second chapter of the book is called Excavation. And so it really is a calling to do a little bit of that inner work that maybe you've been avoiding. So that, in the case of writing my book in 2020, like, that was an extreme case of that, where, I was just excavating a ton of stuff at a very like high volume. But I think, I think loneliness it can teach you things about yourself if you just take the time to listen.
And what would you say? I mean, loneliness is something I think that everyone deals with from time to time. I think the pandemic really brought it forward. But if you had to, so let's say, go back and maybe send a message out to the world about people at that particular time, a time where solitude wasn't a choice, it was enforced. What would you say to people, or what would you say even to yourself? Like, I guess, what is it now? 4 years ago, 3 years ago? Time flies, right? But what would you kind of say to yourself going through that loneliness phase, that enforced loneliness phase, to make it even worse?
I mean, now I would say, I guess, like, as, Katie from the future with like the crystal ball, like, of course I could say, it's only temporary, like, we're going to get back together again. Don't sweat it too much. Because I think one of the scariest things at that time was it was so unknown. We didn't know how long is this going to go on for. That first lockdown in particular, and, March, April 2020 was a terrifying time of immense uncertainty. I think it really showed people just how uncertain our lives are, and just how easily things can change, and what was known to us can be ripped away from us. So I think it put a lot in perspective for people. But what I would say to people, and what I would say to myself, at that time is, again, if I could say, I would want to say, nothing is forever. Like, everything is temporary. Like, even this feeling that you're feeling tonight, it's not going to be there forever. It'll probably be gone in the morning. And if you are given time or forced to have time in any kind of isolation, try to, look for ways that you can make use of that time and, get to know yourself a little bit better, try to create something, learn something about yourself in the way that you learn about how you can take care of yourself a little bit better, how you can self-soothe, because I think that's something that I learned very intimately in that process in 2020 was self-regulating and self-soothing. And I did that through that process of writing and exercise, meditation. And it's funny, like, now, years later in my life, I'm very happy. Life is good. We're not really, we're not in lockdown. I am in a healthy relationship. I'm engaged. Like, it's a different world, but I am not using necessarily all of those techniques as much as I did in that time, which I think is really fascinating, because I guess they were so necessary, where I needed that routine. But I think about it now, and I could still really benefit from a consistent meditation practice, consistent yoga, for example. And so it's just interesting that, what can come out in a time of crisis. And I guess thinking about how, these tools that we need in those times are also really helpful in a time of like maintenance, or whatever you want to call it, and happy times. You can always improve our mindset and our mental health. And but yeah, it's just kind of an interesting reflection, I guess, from where I am now.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of your foreword, actually, which I have here. You said, this is just one line from it. It was an age when creating routine became survival. And that really resonated with me, because I've always been routine driven. But I think what COVID taught me was that, all of a sudden everyone's working from home, and your enforced routine went right out the window. So you're no longer required to start work at 8. You're no longer required, to be at the gym at the right time when there's not a million people there. Like all of these external factors just fell away. And so really for me, it was a time to understand the importance of those routines and why it's important to like get up at the same time every day. And so like, I think this, correct me if I'm wrong, but this really, to me, this idea that creating routine becomes survival, that's really what you have when shit hits the fan. Mm-hmm. And I thought about this a couple months ago. I was really, it's going through a bit of a, not too rough of a time, but you got these little phases in your life where mm-hmm. some things just kind of don't seem to be working out. And it's the routine that saves me, at least. Like I find refuge in the routine. I find refuge in the fact that I can still go to the gym at 5 and still get up at the same time and still do a little bit of work, maybe in no small part because you're doing something useful. And I think that's another thing that we missed, which is a very Stoic idea and something that you took advantage of because you wrote this wonderful book here. But when in doubt, do something that's useful. And a lot of times what that is work. And a lot of times it's self-work, which includes like routine. What am I doing today to take care of myself? But also, what am I doing to contribute to the world? And, this is a prime example. I'll flash it for the camera. But yeah, what do you think about that?
Well, thank you. I think that I agree. And I think that that's a lot of where my mindset was when I realized that I wanted to turn it into a book. I thought a lot about, this being a contribution, to the world. And it was just something that I could add into the landscape of art that came out in the pandemic, music, books. There was so much creation that was done in that time, which I think says a lot about, our society and our culture and where people were at. Like once we actually slowed down, so much creative energy just kind of started to explode. So I got so much fulfillment out of being able to create something out of that uncertain and difficult time.
Yeah. And I also like I think you went through some really important growth here too, which is obviously you owned what you went through. So you own the story, which makes it yours, which it always was yours. But whether or not we own something is a difference between, suffering because of it or becoming stronger through it. And so you have this one poem where you're basically talking about how you're reluctant to change the locks on your doors, which your therapists and your friends are advising you to do. Change your locks so you can feel safe. And you make the point that you didn't want to become a statistic. Like you didn't want to say it out loud because that makes it real. And this is something that you hear pretty often. And I think this is what I want your input on, but it seems to me that there's a little bit of paradoxically ego and self-esteem issues in that at the same time. There's the ego part of it where it's like, well, I'm just going to be a statistic. But people go through shit. Like everyone goes through shit. Everyone has rough times. Not everyone goes through what you went through. Some people go through different things. But the fact that someone did something bad to you, part of that is just the human experience. And then so you went from that perspective of I don't want to own this. I don't want to make this real, where on the other end of it, you end up fully owning it and you say, this is what happened and this is how I felt. So what do you think about that?
Wow, there's so much to unpack there. I'm glad that you brought this piece up because I'm actually like eager to unpack it, and I haven't actually thought about this part of the experience for a long time. But I guess to like give a little bit of context to it, so yeah, there's a lot of ego kind of, in the lines there for sure. And like, I'm glad that you picked that up. I think that that's not something I realized at the time of like writing it or feeling it. But of course now, like looking back, it can reflect and see that. But, I I was the person who was like known to be like a very independent person, like a feminist, like very strong-minded person, and I prided myself in these like identities that were in part given to me and in part, earned and embodied perhaps, but that's how I was known. And so when I had this abusive relationship, I didn't call it that for a long, long, long time. I did not call it that. Because I didn't want to acknowledge that. As you said, I didn't want to make it real. And, when he had like broken into my apartment and, things happened, and I, of course, wasn't feeling safe after that, I knew that he probably had like made a copy of the key and things like that. The intellectual like part of me, of course, was like, well, I need to change the locks now. Obviously, I'm not safe here, but there was it was one of those doors with the bolts, I guess, like the kind of chain, so you had that second line of defense. So I would just kind of put the chain on, and I didn't change the locks for a long time, and because of that I like suffered more than I needed to, and I like lived in fear for much longer. And the reason is it's around like that stigma of, I don't want to be a statistic. I don't want to admit that this was an abusive relationship, that I am someone who was in an abusive relationship, because I just saw myself, so differently. And I was stigmatizing myself, I think, right? Like, abusive relationships are extremely common for women, for men, for non-binary people. Like it's so much more common, but we don't talk about it all the time. And it can happen to anyone. It doesn't matter if you're, a very like independent, fierce person. And so I had to do a lot of work and a lot of like ego work to actually get past that and take that simple action of getting my locks changed, because I knew to get my locks changed, I had to reach out to my landlord and my rental company. And I didn't want them to know. I didn't want to have to explain the situation and explain why, because I felt shame. And around that section of the book, I talk a lot about shame and what shame actually, what it feels like, and kind of how it lives in your body and how it takes control over you. And that's something that stops a lot of domestic abuse survivors from like speaking out, from, because they just don't want people to know the reality they've been living in, that, they've been, quote, like complicit in it, and they've accepted this. And, when I finally did reach out to my rental company and tell them the situation, unfortunately, I was not met with compassion. I was not met with understanding. And, I was given like a bill, and, I think that, just as a side note, like we need to do more to support people who are kind of reaching out for help in these situations. But yeah, it was a battle with my ego. And I think it is a good example of kind of that growth that I did to get to the end of that and make that decision. And it sounds like a small decision and it sounds obvious. Yes, just change your locks. But it actually was a lot of mental work for me to get there. Yeah.
Hey there, let me thank you for being a listener. If you enjoy the podcast, there are a few things you can do to help me out. A 5-star review on Spotify or wherever you're listening to this really does help, and it's free. You can also join my Substack free or premium subscription, each with different benefits. Substack free gets you the podcast emailed directly to you along with some articles. Substack premium supporters get access to full episodes of Paradoxically Speaking, a podcast with my good friend Joshua Bertolotti from In Search of Wisdom. My Steps to Success interview series is also on the Substack Premium, as well as an additional article every 2 weeks breaking down a Stoic quote. I appreciate any support you can offer, but if you cannot, for whatever reason, afford a premium subscription, I will happily grant you one for free, no questions asked. Just email me at thestrongstoic@gmail.com. Yeah, I feel that too. I think a lot of people do. There's this fear of making a wrong decision. There's a fear of doing something stupid. There's a fear of looking stupid. There's a fear of, how could I be so dumb as to let this situation happen the way that it's happening? And man, like I get that. Like I really get that fear. But I also know that you have absolutely no business at all holding yourself to that standard. Like you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You don't know what's going to happen in a week. When you choose to be in a relationship with someone, you choose to love them, that's really like an act of courage. Because to do so, you have to let your walls down. To do so, you have to be willing to sleep around them where you're really vulnerable. Love is cast in vulnerability. And so if you do the best with what you have, like, you have no business, I'm mostly speaking to myself here, you have no business holding yourself to that standard. Everyone makes dumb decisions. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone does things that maybe they regret in the future. But how can you regret something if it was really like an act of courage? Like, you're doing the best with what you have, and maybe you don't have the wisdom, the knowledge at that time to properly deal with it, but that's not up to you. And maybe now you can have that knowledge and wisdom with what you've been through if you look at it in the right perspective. So I absolutely love that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a beautiful affirmation to share with me and to share with the audience, to consider that you didn't do anything wrong in trying to love a person. And so you shouldn't sit here and blame yourself and take on all of this shame. And, it's that's something I had to learn and come to terms with, because your first reaction is, to think about, okay, well, I put myself in this situation in this way. But at the end of the day, like, I didn't, control this person's actions. They chose to act how they did. They, were raised in such a way that, these behaviors manifested, through their own experiences, through their own hurt and their own pain. And really his lack of healing, that manifested that behavior. And that's not on me. All I did was try to, be in a relationship with someone and love a person and, by the end of it, survive it. And so there's actually, this reminds me of like a really kind of poetic, beautiful thing that my partner has said. So my partner, Matt's very like emotionally intelligent kind of person. And we were talking about this like a couple years ago, and he shared something that really stuck with me, which is to say that these qualities that you have of, giving someone the benefit of the doubt, being a loving person, being someone who wants to try to make things work, those are all good qualities if it's with the right person. Right? If it's with the wrong person, they can be manipulated. But those aren't qualities that you should, get rid of. Like, those are beautiful parts about yourself. But, with the right person, that's going to be amazing. And with the wrong person, like, they are going to try to take advantage of the person that you are. Because I am someone who, like, I'm pretty big empath, I would say. And, I still experienced like guilt in leaving this person and feeling bad for, what their life was going to be now that they couldn't live here, and where were they going to live. And those are qualities that when you find the right person and they love you the way that you should be loved, like, that's beautiful. And it's not a part of you should take away. I think the result of going through a relationship like this shouldn't be that you become really hard and really closed off. So I tried not to harden too much. I think naturally you do harden a little bit, but I tried to be mindful of it. And the amazing thing that came out of it was I learned so much from the relationship in terms of, things to look out for, like red flags that I didn't necessarily pick up before. And this coming out of this relationship and writing this book, and as you said, like really owning this story, which I feel that I did, that was part of the healing, is owning the narrative. In my words, in my experience, this is what it was. this is real. I'm putting it out into the world. And when I came out of that, I was the most confident I've ever been in my life. I was the most just confident in my boundaries, in my self-esteem. I knew exactly what I wanted, exactly what I didn't want. And I was so fiercely protective of myself when I moved into relationships in the future. And that served me so well. And that is something that I am grateful for, to be honest.
Absolutely. Yeah, if you own the narrative, you get to write the final chapters.
Mm.
And if you don't own them, you don't get to write the final chapters, and someone else is going to write them for you. But yeah, you raise a very interesting point, because so courage is a cardinal virtue, but also is wisdom. So to your point, if you can act foolishly, and that's no longer really a courageous act, right? So you can certainly put yourself in relationships that are clearly going to just destroy you, and that becomes, I mean, that can be tied into some kind of toxicity, but it can also be tied into just foolishness, just not knowing any better. So it's absolutely the case, and this is where this idea comes into incorporating and learning from what you've been through, because I had this talk with a friend of mine too recently, and she went through a pretty toxic relationship, and I was pretty close with both of them, so it was rough, and then she did a lot of work, and she's on the other side of it and really kicked ass as a single mother. But as she was starting to date again, and she got a boyfriend, and they're talking about moving in together, and she starts getting worried about this. Like, well, what if it happens again? What if I go through the exact same thing? Like, obviously, how foolish am I going to look, but also, how am I going to deal with that? And I said to her, well, it's, even if you make the same decision, let's say to move in with this person, and full well that it could go bad. It could. There's always the possibility. Always. But judging by what you know right now about this person, can you ever see that happening? And she said no. And I said, well, then it's an act of courage. Mm-hmm. And you can't get love without courage. And so I think, yeah, you can make foolish decisions. But as long as you're moving forward in life and you're learning from that past, it's no longer foolishness. It's wise. It's courageous. It's beautiful, really.
Yeah, I agree. I think, we can always be hurt again. We can always, right? Like I like that idea of like, there's no love without courage. Like, we have to put ourselves out there. We have to be vulnerable. And, when we go through experiences like this, we get wiser, and we get more attuned to ourselves and to possibly the intentions of other people. We learn to screen better. We learn our boundaries and our preferences, and we become better advocates for ourselves. Yeah. And, that risk I think, the benefits of, and the fulfillment that can be found in, long-term partnership, for example, in this scenario that we're talking about, are immense. And so they're worth pursuing. But I think you just need to take time and make sure that you've done enough kind of self-care and inner work to make sure you're ready to be vulnerable again and take that next step. It's worth it. But these are the experiences that teach you so much about yourself. They actually kind of arm you and prepare you to be better next time. Yeah,
100%. I love it. And speaking of love, so maybe we can dig a little bit deeper into love, because you talk, obviously it's I would say one of several themes in your writing. But you have this idea that there's a passage here. Let's see if I can find it. It's something, okay, sometimes the people that say they love us are the ones that hurt us the most. And so obviously I thought that was very, very interesting, because it really begs the question, like, what is love? So, not to get too mushy, but when you think of that, like, what do you think that is? There's lots of answers, and most of them are right. Some of them are not right, but most of them are right. But in the context of, let's say, your writing, how are you thinking about that?
Well, first of all, I'm a poet, so I love to get mushy, get into all of that, clearly. But I don't know, I guess the question of what, that's a big topic. Like, what is love? What is love to me? Maybe it's a little bit different. It's a little bit different for everyone. I think for me, in exploring like different themes in the book that I was exploring, there's different types of love. So, I start off talking about, love in terms of like a relationship and getting out of this abusive relationship, kind of realizing what that was. And then I move into sort of, trying to date in the pandemic, and again, like searching for love in that context of a romantic relationship. But further in the book, as the pandemic and lockdown is getting more severe, I started reflecting around love in a more macro sense, in terms of like, all of our relationships, like country to country, and like family members, and just the love and connection that human beings really thrive on. And for me, like the most important love that came out of this period of self-discovery, and the most important key theme of love in the book, Love in the Age of Quarantine, is actually not about romantic love, but it's about self-love. And that was for me the most critical kind of piece of growth and evolution that I had, was realizing that I don't need a romantic relationship to fulfill me, to make me feel whole and happy. I can actually get to a place where, I feel whole just loving myself and like doing that healing. And so that was kind of, the journey that I went on. And of course, partnership is amazing, and it's fulfilling, and it's very important. But at the end of the day, I think you need to prioritize loving yourself and taking care of yourself first before you put yourself kind of out there in that arena.
Yeah, I love that you said taking care of yourself, because that's kind of how I try and think about that idea of self-love as well. Because I think some people think that like loving yourself means you're just kind of in this state of constant affection for yourself. And it's like, that's obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously.
I love how you kind of like hugged yourself
yeah,
while you did that.
For those not watching, I'm hugging myself a little bit as this self-love. And maybe that's part of self-love, right? Because obviously there has to be some kind of affection in there. But a lot of times love is doing things that you might not want to do. Like we talked about ice baths before this, and I'm very happy that you're an ice bather as well. You're a fellow psycho, as I like to call it. But that's an action that, given what it does for you, can be seen as an act of self-love. But you wouldn't often think about that, right?
Exactly. And I think like conversely, to kind of flip it, another thing I looked at in the book was this idea of what are like, we know what self-love is. Okay, I'm talking about these different strategies, but what looks like an act of like violence to yourself? That's something that I had to really confront, was that realizing that I had been doing certain things that were a violence to myself, even if I didn't realize it at the time. And one of the things that was the realization that actually helped me get out and stay out of that relationship, was finally realizing that going back to that relationship was an act of violence to myself. And it took really understanding that and digesting that for me to just finally like have that click in my brain, that I don't want to treat myself like that. I don't want to harm myself like that.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I have that one here. Going back to something that hurt you is a violence to the self. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I commented under it. I said it's not an act of love. it's hard. It might be hard to call it hate, but it's certainly not love, which is quite interesting. You also have this idea that you talk about how love, you thought or you used to think or you want to believe that it's an infinite resource. And I thought that was interesting too, because one of the ways you can think about love, such as taking care of yourself, it's an action, and you only have so much time, so you can only do so many actions. What have you? I didn't see a whole lot of evolvement, or maybe I missed it. But maybe can you expand on that? Like, how do you think about that now?
So, well, I think like that poem is the one where I'm talking about the metaphor of like, could I bring, if I could pull like an infinite amount of love out of my hat, like a musician or like a magician, if I could pull these handkerchiefs, so it was that one, right?
Yeah, it is that one. Yeah. And out of your rib cage. Yeah.
Yes.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. Would you mind reading it just so I can refresh my mind? Okay.
Sure.
Thanks.
If I give all of my love and care to someone who gives nothing back, will I have enough to care for myself? I want to believe love is an infinite resource, that I can endlessly pull it out of my rib cage, like a chain of colorful bandanas from a hat. But what happens if you don't have any magic left over for yourself?
Okay. Yes. I love that piece, actually.
Yeah, I do as well. It's beautiful.
Oh, thank you. So, yeah, I think what I was talking about there, I was starting to realize that, I had been doing so much caregiving and giving so much love and attention to this relationship and to this person who, just didn't deserve it, to be frank. And so I started to realize the impact that then has on me. So if I am just giving so much love and so much time and so much attention and energy to someone, what is left over for you at the end of the day? So I don't believe, I don't know. It's an interesting question. Like, do I believe love is an infinite resource or not? I think we have really big capacity, a really large capacity for love. We can love many people at once. We can love our communities. We can love our families. I want to say that it's, infinite, but I suppose the energy that we use to love the people in our lives and care for people, I would say has a limit. Like, the energy that it takes for me to like take care of like an animal, or like, if I had a child, or if I had like, it just takes energy out of you. And I think we do have to be a little bit selective with how we dole that loving energy out, because we do need to keep some of that for ourselves. And I think a lot of times people struggle with that. If you like have a couple kids and like they're going to be your priority, and you're going to be doing everything for them. And I think that's something, like, I know a lot of like people that I know that have young kids, like that's where everything goes, right? Like that's where all of their fuel is going. And all in our own ways, we all have to find a way to bring some of that back home.
Yeah, I would entirely agree. And I wrote under that, love is not an infinite resource because it is an action, and actions take time, and we only have so much time. And so in one perspective, it's definitely not an infinite resource. In another perspective, to play Obi-Wan Kenobi, to look at it through a different point of view, now we've got Lord of the Rings competing with Star Wars. Very nerdy, but I got all the references so far, so I think that's pretty good. Yeah, love the nerds. Everyone needs to be a nerd. But I think if you think about it in the sense of, if you love in the right way to the right people, it actually is simultaneously a love for yourself. So I think there's some, let's say, there's some that you need to keep for yourself, because to our point, everyone needs a bit of solitude from time to time. Like there is some let's say form of love that only you can give yourself, 100%. At the same time, let's say you're really loving the right partner. that is going to give back to you in so many ways that only are seen when you're looking in the past, right? Like they propagate through time. And that's another great argument for kids, right? Like you might be self-sacrificing now, but then the reward from that in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years could very well be considered an act of love for you right now, even though maybe it doesn't feel that way. So yeah, it's complicated. It's complicated. But yeah, I do think at the end of the day, when we get down to like this practical idea of love, which is action, it's like you only got so much time. And you got to sleep sometime.
Yeah.
Right? So
yeah, I like that. I like that, like using the lens of love being an action. I think you're absolutely right. It's an action. It takes time. So I think it is limited, and you know, realizing that was one of my building blocks of like self-esteem that I was building back, right? Like realizing that my time had value and meaning, my love had meaning. It wasn't, you know, it was something that was important that I shouldn't just give away to the wrong person, and something that I can keep close to me, and I don't have to just give away to anyone. I'm going to give it to the person who deserves it. And you know, that you know, did a lot for my confidence, and that's definitely a message that I want people to consider in their own lives is don't downplay the significance of your time, and don't downplay the value of your love and what you have to offer another person, especially a romantic partner.
yeah, amen to that. I wanted to ask you in along the same lines of, so there's a paradox, I think, of love, and I'll read this Bob Marley quote because he kind of sums it up. He said, "The truth is everyone is going to hurt you. You just got to find the ones worth suffering for." So there seems to be a weird paradox in love, and you know, I'm sure we can all talk about people we love dearly, and there seems to be like a little bit of maybe not suffering, but certainly pain from time to time, right? Like everyone knows you spend 2 weeks over Christmas with your family, and before you know it, you're fighting, like you know, like that kind of thing. There's pain in there, and there's a little bit of suffering, and so it's kind of this, like to Bob Marley's point, it's like everyone's gonna hurt you. You just gotta find the ones that's worth suffering for. But then that, like, what is worth suffering for? Like that's a very hard question, because you can imagine no relationship is perfect, but some are going to be, let's say, more perfect than others. But like, how do you really distinguish that, right? So you're in this relationship, and this is, I think I saw a lot of this where you're doubting yourself in terms of, should I leave? Should I stay? There's times where he's really loving. There's other times where he's a tyrant and he's just a complete savage. And I think maybe most of us go through this, if not all of us, with people we love and care about, where it's like you get these kind of swings from time to time. Clearly, sometimes it's not good. But like, how do you navigate through that? Because it is a very tough thing. I mean, everyone you love is going to hurt you. How do you know who is worth it and who is not?
I love this question. I have a lot to say.
Let's do it.
Yes, I have so much that's coming up for me right now, because I am really interested in reading like psychology, like love psychology books. So I read a lot of relationship books. I'm very into like the Gottman Institute, like John and Julie Gottman and their research. So I actually study this a lot. To go back to what you're saying around like there's those times where you kind of get pulled back in, and that's a very common dynamic in these relationships, right? Sometimes it's like called breadcrumbing, where you know they leave just a little bit that it pulls you back in. Maybe you know like there's a poem in the book where I say basically one day, you know, he's this tidal wave and this tsunami, like, you know, kind of destroying your whole world, and the next day he's this like flat warm water that you kind of want to lay your head back into. And that's kind of the up and downs that can happen. But I love, and I agree with this quote from Bob Marley around, like love is, everyone's going to hurt you in some way. I think that's human relationships. Absolutely. It's, and in relationships and romantic relationships, it's such a good question. Like, what do we put up with? Like, how do we know, is this worth it or not? And one of the quotes from the John Gottman that he talks about is this idea that you, in relationships, you're always going to have conflict, and it's going to be slightly different with different partners, but it's always going to be there. And the conflict that you have with any one partner typically is something that's going to remain unresolved for life. It's going to remain unresolved for the most part for your whole your whole relationship. So what you have to do is you have to decide what is the conflict that is worth or that I'm okay kind of managing for the rest of my life. Who is the partner that I want to sign up to manage this conflict with for the rest of my life? And I actually think that's really beautiful and really freeing. And it stops us from this idea of like the grass is always greener, right? You might get into a healthy relationship and, things are great, but then you're different in this one way, but you're so compatible in other ways, but, you're different in this one way. And, that might make you think, oh, I should jump ship, I should find someone else. And then, okay, you move on to someone else and another problem arises. So you're always going to have this key conflict that's never properly solved, but it's all about how do you manage your disagreements, your differences, and your conflict with this person, because you're always going to have conflict. So for me, I'm really, really lucky in the way that like I have found my person and I've found the conflict that I am so happy to have for the rest of my life. I have found the person that, just based in the way that we communicate with each other and the way that we respect each other when we have differences. And I feel so safe in addressing conflict with him. So I'm so confident in that because I've found this argument, if you will, or this conflict that I'm ready to, keep talking about for the rest of our life because he's worth it. He's my person. He's, he's so kind and gentle and fun, and he's my best friend. And I think, it's in the way that, he's shown me over time that, even though we have differences and we have conflict, it's something that we're always willing to, come to the table, calmly discuss and find compromise. So I don't know if that, if I'm just rambling about my relationship now, or if that really kind of helps like draw a picture for people. But I think it's such an interesting question, because that's something that if you would have asked me like a few years ago, I'm sure I would have had a very different answer. Like I wouldn't have felt any confidence in this. But I think that's just a really powerful sentiment to just remember that with all human beings, you're always going to have a conflict with someone. It doesn't matter, who you get into a relationship with. There's going to be something, because we're not copies of each other. We're unique human beings. We have different personalities and we have different dreams and desires. Of course, there's some things that are maybe so different, like it's not going to work. Say if one person really wants kids and the other person doesn't, like, there's maybe things like that. But I think for the most part, you'll know when you find someone. I'll put it to you this way. I'm working on a second book right now, and it's a bit of a lighter book, a lighter experience. I'm actually writing a lot about like love and happiness, which it's funny, it doesn't come as easily to pen and paper as, the trauma and like the darker stuff. So I really have to kind of be disciplined. But one of the poems that I've written for my second book, I'm sort of talking about this idea that, I say something like, I've never come out of an argument loving someone more before, right? Like it's, or being more sure of this person. When we argue, when we address our conflict or our differences, or I feel even more sure about this person and that he is for me, and that, he's, that he's my person. So, yeah.
I'm very, very, very happy for you. That's wonderful. Sounds like you have a great relationship, and it's really beautiful. It's great to see.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to just watch someone talk about their person, honestly.
Oh, thank you. No, I just feel like I rambled about it so much, but it's something I feel really passionate about, because I think when you go from the experience of, being in an abusive relationship, or just a ill-matched relationship, an incompatible relationship, and you're on the other side where conversely you find this like extremely compatible relationship that's so healthy, you've never experienced that before, and so loving and freeing and safe. Like, it's just, I think if you feel safe, like, that's a good sign. And so I think because I've kind of been on both spectrums, where I've had that really bad, multiple bad experiences, and here I am, like, I'm just, really I want everyone to find that. And I think it becomes crystal clear to you when you can kind of compare and contrast, right? I know what it is to feel unsafe in a relationship, to be on eggshells in an argument, to not be able to tell my partner, that I'm like, I don't know, that I have a male friend, for example, that I'm talking to, right? And then like being on the totally other end of the spectrum with someone who is securely attached, number one, and, is a confident person. And there's just, I don't have the up and downs anymore. I think that's another good sign to look out for is, do you have a lot of up and downs in the relationship? Like, are you having those big highs and you're making up, and then it's down low again? And like, I think relationships, of course, are work, but in my experience, I'll give you a Sierra de Mulder quote. Sierra de Mulder is a U.S. poet. She is a beautiful, beautiful writer. And one of her quotes that it's just so moving to me. She says, "There is love out there that won't make you work this hard." And I just want people to think about that when they're in these relationships, that it's a roller coaster, it's up and down, it's eggshells. Just remember that I really believe like there is love out there that's not going to make you work that hard, but you need to love yourself enough to be able to find it. And that's something I had to learn. If I don't get out of this relationship, if I don't get rid of the bad, I will never make space for the good. And that's what I did in the book, basically. So
yeah, I love that. And I think the conflict part is important to recognize, because there's always going to be a little bit of conflict, right? That's inherent. And like you said, we're human beings, and you probably get a little bored if you didn't have any conflict, right? Like it's kind of an interesting thing when you're getting, you get these phases in your relationship, weeks, maybe even months, where things are like going really well. And then something happens, and then they bite your head off, and it's like, oh wow, that's interesting. Like, what's going on here? But and there's this song called "Love We Need." I think that's the name of it, and it's got this lyric in there that I really love. It's, "We never go to bed angry because we never fight." And if you read that at face value, you think, well, that's a good thing. You never go to bed angry. But the whole song is about how their whole relationship is built on practicality, on like getting this life that we want, but not the love that we actually need. And so it's a very interesting song, because it really puts into context, like, you need a little bit of that. And there's studies on this too, where relationships that are too positive don't last, because there's no challenge. People get bored. We're a really weird species psychologically. Things could be going so well for us, and the first thing we want to do is tear the whole damn thing down because we get bored. And that's I don't know if you know Dostoevsky. He's a Russian author, but he has this idea that if we found utopia, if we designed the perfect society, the first thing we would do is tear the whole damn thing down because we're so bored. And so that's kind of a darker element of what you're talking about. But I think, to your point, there's always going to be a little bit of conflict. And as long as it's not to the point, obviously it can get really severe. You have to, let's say, measure the frequency and make sure this isn't something that should be going on every day for 2 years, right? It's going to be phases where you fight a little bit more. There's going to be phases where you fight a little bit less. But yeah, I think a little bit of that can actually be healthy and good in the long term, even though it doesn't feel like it sometimes.
Yeah, it's how you manage it, I think. It's how you're always going to have the conflict, and conflict is not a bad thing. It's just, in many cases, it's just completely natural. And yeah, it's how you manage it, how you communicate, because it's always going to be present in some way. So you can tell a lot, I think, about the longevity potential of a healthy relationship based on, how do you communicate to each other in those times, and do you make sure the other person is heard, and are you respectful, are you validating of their feelings even if they're different than how you feel about a situation. And what I did actually after I left this relationship, the abusive relationship, I started to notice that I was having separation anxiety. And even though I knew intellectually that this person was like completely like toxic to my life, I was still having the separation anxiety because we had lived together. I was used to this person being around for a long time. We all develop attachments, right? And so I was having panic attacks, and I couldn't understand why my brain was acting like this when, I knew this is better. Like, he's out of my life. This is good. But you have to like detox people and get them out of your life. But one of the ways that I helped myself in that situation was I started to read these like love psychology books, because I wanted to understand intellectually like what is going on in my body, in my brain, that's making me feel this way, because I believe that knowledge is power. So I read this book called Getting the Love You Want. And the authors are like Harville Hendricks or something, and someone else. I can't remember the exact authors, but it's a love psychology book. And in the book, they talk about what happens to your body when you have a relationship end, and how your body actually, like, you grieve it kind of like a death. And I think understanding what was happening in my brain was helpful. They talked about how when you're in a romantic relationship, your subconscious brain, or your like evolutionary kind of more animal brain, let's say, that's not the proper like term, but your brain actually maps the image of this partner as like your caregiver. So your subconscious like reads this person as your caregiver. So naturally you grow this big attachment to them, and your subconscious feels that you need them to survive. So that's, one of the hardest things about leaving relationships is like your body has a reaction to it, which I think is really interesting. But getting into those books helped me learn a lot about what was going on in my body and my brain, and was really empowering, and then helped me kind of process things even further. So I'd recommend trying to learn more about, how our brains work if you're going through something like that.
And at what point did you have clarity that was for the best? Like leaving, because there's internal conflict where you're not sure if you want to leave, and then you get these instances where you want to leave, and then there's a certain point, and what's interesting is it's not directly related to how much pain you're going through, right? Because sometimes it's like when you're going through, sometimes it's like the deepest pain that you feel, where it's like, I know this is suffering right now, but I know there's something beautiful on the other side of it. Ice baths.
Yes.
Right? So when was that point of clarity where you saw that, despite, let's say, the current pain and suffering, that there is something else on the other side of it?
So do you mean kind of after I had already left? Like when did it start to kick in for me that, or do you mean in the relationship? What prompted me to make that final decision to leave?
I would say like while you were still in it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that I knew it kind of like in my, in my body for a long time that I needed to get out of the situation, but again, it's like taking that step that's so difficult. And because there was strings attached of like being on a lease together, all of these complications, I had guilt, even though I shouldn't have had guilt in being trying to caretake this person still. But I had guilt of like, well, where is he gonna go? Like, and I was on eggshells trying to figure out how to get him, out of the apartment. I couldn't just kick him out. So there was like logistics to it. But I think like I guess like what kind of did it was just there was an evening that things really, really escalated, and he was, the most violent that he had been, and he was kind of on a rampage, and he was breaking things and punching walls and flipping tables and, smashing wine glasses and, threatening to kill me basically. And I think something just like turned in that moment, and I just sort of like realized like this is not going to be my life. I'm not going to live like this. And I went into our bedroom and I opened up the drawers and I took his passport and I started taking his clothes and things like that. And I, went to the living room where he was just huffing and puffing around, and I threw everything on the floor and I said, like, get out, like, you're done, like, leave or I'm going to call the police. And that was the night, like, I, firmly decided he needed to go. And the process of actually like separating from then on was not super clean cut, but the relationship did end at that time. And I think something just connected in me, right? I'm not going to deal with this anymore. But sometimes it takes getting to that point, because I think you can be in denial, because especially we can have that like sunk cost fallacy of, oh, well, we've been together X amount of time, and so I don't want to like throw away all that time. And that's bullshit. Like, we shouldn't, like, that has nothing to do with it. Even if you've been together for 20 years, right? Like, if it's abusive, if it's not right for you, there's no need to suffer for another 20 years or another year or another month, right? And I think even though I did that and I got him, out of my life, again, there still was that transitional period that we were talking about, then realizing, having my brain my subconscious brain maybe catching up to the decision that I had made, and realizing that, this is right, because I think my body panicked a little bit, at the isolation and the finality of it, and the loneliness. And so, it took time to realize that, for my body to, be at peace with what happened. And after I learned that that's a totally normal biological response, that was actually really affirming for me. It helped a lot.
Awesome. And how do you think about, so you got a great lens looking backwards. One of the things that I even when things are going great for me, I try and remind myself of is that, the flood is always coming. Winter is coming, as the Starks put it. Let's throw in another nerdy reference. But how do you think about future trauma? Like, I think you've gained a lot of wisdom and perspective from this. Do you kind of think like I do, in the sense that, yes, eventually something maybe not that bad, maybe just as it could be your parents dying, it could be a close friend. Like, life is just full of tragedy, unfortunately. How do you think about that going forward? And like, obviously you have the tools, you have, let's say, respect for yourself, I would hope, due to the strength it took to become who you are now. How do you think going forward? It's a hard question. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
that's that's such a hard question. Wow. I mean, I would say, throw another abusive relationship at me. I know how to handle it. I'll, be out of that, processed it, write another book, move on. Like that's something, I now kind of have the playbook. I know how to deal with that. I guess I guess in terms of like how I deal with future trauma, to be honest, like, yeah, these tools that I've developed and taking something ugly and turning it into something beautiful, I think is something that is going to continue to serve me. When one of the fears that I have, of course, like most human beings is, my parents, losing, another family member, losing a friend, having a child and losing a child. Like there's many scenarios that I can sit and kind of, there's, to quote Brene Brown, like dress rehearse trauma, right? Like I can think in my head of this happening or that happening, or, even something like, what if my cat gets out and like goes into the woods and I never see her and she gets taken by a coyote? Like, that is something that I fight with at times, is like trying to, manage these thoughts that come up. Like, I don't know if you saw the Barbie movie.
No, I haven't actually.
You need to see it.
I don't know if I would say if I did, but I haven't. Just to be clear, I have not.
You can tell me offline.
I'll tell you after the podcast.
Well, in the Barbie movie, there's a joke around like one of the Barbies is, instead of like fashion Barbie or like airline Barbie, she's irrepressible thoughts of death Barbie, okay. Right? Which I think is very relatable. Like I do struggle thinking about like what, dying, or like what happens when you die. But I think overall, I have developed these tools which will serve me in processing the trauma that comes. I'm lucky in that way, where like I'm also a songwriter and I sing, so I get a lot of healing and meditation out of writing songs. So I will, when these things come up, I will write about them. I will, write about loss and grief that comes up, whatever the case may be. But I think that this experience that I went through, in a way, it sounds cliche, but it did make me stronger, and it does prepare me to handle tough situations in the future, because it, kind of proves to you what you can go through, and that you can go through pain and create something out of it and find utility in it. And it, in a small way, it's similar to doing like cold plunges, as you're saying, right? Like you're building your resilience, you're putting yourself in a little bit of a pain and discomfort and showing yourself that you can get through it. So yeah.
And that's confidence,
Mm-hmm.
right? Confidence is, it's not looking yourself in the mirror and saying you are confident. You are a confident person. It's getting through things. And ultimately, like I have the most confidence when I do things that I respect. Like that I could look at, if I looked at someone else doing that thing. And this is such a cool trick, because we all kind of have an idea of who we respect. It's like, well, what are they doing? Like, are they cold plunging every morning? Maybe you can do that. And then maybe you can respect yourself. And then maybe you can have confidence. And then maybe someone can respect you. And then maybe you can inspire them. And it's it's a very useful input.
So I want to turn the question around to you. And I want to know, I want to know how you would how would you deal with being irrepressible thoughts of death, Ken, for example, right? Like how do you deal with like thinking about future traumas and how you're going to manage it, and what would be, I guess, like the Stoic perspective on, managing these things as they come?
Yeah, well, there's two approaches. The first is kind of what you're doing, which is premeditatio malorum, premeditation of evils, where you think through what could happen, and then you kind of pick it apart a little bit, right? So you might say, okay, well, eventually my parents are going to die. My mother or my father's going to die. How can I actually manage that? Like, well, I know that everyone goes through that, so I can take refuge in that. It's a shared suffering, and there's something about shared suffering that makes it just a little bit easier. You also know that, to your point, there's tools here. There's writing. I know what's worked in the past. I know that there's certain things that, regardless of how much I don't want to do them, I'm going to do them. I'm going to exercise. I'm going to lift. I'm going to write. Not going to lock myself up. I'm going to make sure I have some time with friends. And I think once you have some clarity on that, really, you just got to, for me, I accept that it's still not going to be pleasant. Like I try and remove pleasant from the whole thought process. It's like, no, your mother, like when my mother dies, I know I listen to Ed Sheeran's music on his about his mother passing, and it always makes me tear up. Like I really love my mother, and can't imagine going through that. But I know I have the tools to get through it, and I know I can get through it, and I know she would want me to get through it. And I also know that because I have that reference point of she is going to die someday, and I am going to have to deal with that, I make sure, for example, after this podcast, I'm going to text her and tell her I love her.
Aww.
So, again, to get back to the mushy, I guess there's a little artist in me too, but
for sure.
Yeah.
That's a good reminder. Like, tell the people that you love them, yeah. and don't wait. Right. That's something my brother's really good at, actually. Like, he's that guy that will just send the random, like, shout out text, right? Just like, hey, love you. You add value to my life. Bye. Like, he's really good at, like, staying close and connected with friends and family that way. And I think, life is unpredictable. It's uncertain. It's short in many ways. So, it's too short to not tell people how you feel and go for what you want. And that's actually why I'm in the, like, healthy, amazing, beautiful relationship I'm in right now, is because I saw this man and I just knew I wanted to be with him. And I knew we kind of grew up together. We went to high school together, and we were both single around the same time. And I just went for it. Asked him out. I just kind of manifested the relationship in a way, I like to say, but yeah. Life is too short. So definitely just put yourself out there, go for what you want, and, tell people how you feel, for sure. But yeah.
Yeah. There's a weird freedom in just saying honest things to people. Mm-hmm. Like I'm very lucky. I got some friends in my life that's like that. They'll tell me, they're happy we're friends and that kind of stuff. And it's such a weird thing, especially for men, because there's this idea, and it seems to me to be inherent in male psychology, but it seems like, you want to stay away from that. And I think that there is 100% a boundary there, right? Like I know some female friends that'll cuddle. I'm never gonna cuddle with my with my bros, right? Like, that's probably never.
Oh, you're missing out.
It's probably never gonna happen. Maybe if we went to war together and something really terrible happened, maybe there might be a little cuddle session. But likely, unless we're really cold, probably not gonna happen. But that isn't to say that we can't show appreciation for each other in our own ways. And that's something actually I learned from my father, because he always made sure that we knew that he loved us. And
that's beautiful.
Coming from a fishing family of very hard men, that's no small thing. So, but I'm very happy seems like you have some great relationships in your life, and I'm very happy for you. I'm happy you wrote this book, and I'm very happy to meet you today. So thank you. I think we're at an hour and a half, which didn't feel like an hour and a half.
Yeah, but, for sure.
But thanks for coming. And how can people support you? Where can they find your book?
Yes, so the book is Love in the Age of Quarantine. You can find it on Amazon. If you just search that, you can get it, online at like Indigo and Chapters. It's in stores as well. But depending on, the area, it might be sold out. I'm not sure, but definitely follow me on Instagram at Ocean Shores and Metaphors. Or just search up Katie Feltmate, and you can follow my Instagram, get updates on where to get the book there, updates on my second book, and you'll have all the links there for the book. But it's all over the place online. So if you search up Love in the Age of Quarantine and my name, you'll find it.
Thank you so much for being here again.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Until next time. Cheers. If you liked this video, please hit the like button and subscribe with the notifications turned on. The Strong Stoic podcast is also available in audio wherever you listen to your podcasts. Finally, you can join Substack to gain access to transcripts, articles, and premium podcast episodes.